to turn out some of the lights so they can see?
Oh yes,
the
I
screen a
will. I
little
will turn out the front
better,
ones.
Or just no
You bet.
falling asleep on us. There's more coffee if you need it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so Zach and I are going to kind of tag team the livestock presentation here. I'm going to start with just a few slides introing KWS hybrid rye and some of the benefits of that. Greg already mentioned some, but we'll highlight how some of those things actually work, and then we'll dive into the monogastric stuff first, and then we'll do the ruminant stuff after. Please feel free to stop us, ask questions, have a discussion. I don't know that I want to just sit here and preach to you for the entire time. So if you have questions, please jump in. If you have comments or experience with things, we love to learn about what's going on out in the landscape as well. So please don't be shy. So just to give you a bit of background on KWS hybrid fall rye. So the breeding program actually dates back to about the 1970s, but it really kind of became established in the 1990s with that breeding program in Europe. But KWS didn't launch the first varieties in North America until 2014 and 2016. So there was a very large period of time where there was genetic development on the hybrid rye in Europe. And then those rye all of a sudden came to North America. So we saw really big boosts to yield and performance and quality because we basically had like 20 odd years worth of breeding that just kind of came here, right? And so it really is the highest yielding cereal grain that's out there when we have those really good conditions for it. So we see 20 to 40% increase over conventional rye, depending on where you are and what the weather patterns are, and then about 10 to 30% over winter wheat. So we do have a pretty good boost to yields when it comes to the crop. And then we also have improved ergot protection. So Greg kind of alluded to that a little bit, but with our KWS varieties, we have a trait that we actually cross into all of our modern varieties. So the ones that you guys all have access to now would have this pollen plus trait. And so I'll talk about that in a minute and how that sort of helps maintain access with our varieties to all markets, because you have a lower risk of ergot with the crop. Because of the high yield, for a livestock producer, at the end of the day, that means you can feed more animals per acre that you're growing, right? Which is a pretty big benefit to anyone who is trying to grow livestock. And in where I am in Ontario, a lot of livestock producers don't have the land base they need to be able to feed all of the livestock themselves. So if they can get, 20% higher yield than their winter wheat, then they're pretty happy with that to be able to feed, right? So, yeah. I was gonna say, if any of my crop people want to jump in at any point too, they can do that. But, so on the sustainability side of things, we do see hybrid rye as having the lowest carbon footprint among all the cereal crops as well. So that's for a few different reasons. And not just on the carbon footprint side, but these provide other benefits to you on your farm as you're growing as well. So rye uses about 25% less water than the other cereal crops do. So, and that's happening because of a couple of reasons. So the photosynthesis in the rye plant is primarily happening through the stem and the head and not through the flag leaf. And so the stem is waxier and you get less water evaporation happening from the plant. So you're able to maintain more of that water yourself and get use of that. And it also has a very large root system. So I'll show you a picture of the root system in a second. But because of that, it can get water from lower down in the soil as well. Plus it can also use early moisture in the spring that maybe some of the other crops can't use as well. So it is more efficient with water usage compared to other crops. It's also more efficient with nitrogen usage. So again, those big roots allow it to get access to nitrogen from lower down in the soil where some of the other crops can't get to, and has a higher use efficiency of nitrogen within the crop itself as well. And then we also see less use of pesticides and herbicides with hybrid rye. So it depends a little bit on your environment and where you are and what you need. But the roots do have an allelopathic property with them, so they are very competitive with other weeds in the fields. I'm sure Jewel and Carolyn could elaborate on this more, but that's not the focus of today. So, yeah, really that root system and the competitiveness of those roots allows us to not rely on pesticides and things like that to the same, herbicides, pesticides to the same level. So this just as an example of what the root structure looks like. On the left is a picture of wheat, and on the right is rye. And so you can see there's actually a much larger root mass with that plant, which allows it to be a lot more efficient when it's looking for nutrients and using nutrients. So Greg touched on the winter hardiness on his one slide, so this just has some numbers around that. Rye is the most winter hardy of all the crops that's out there, so it has a higher cold tolerance, can tolerate much colder temperatures than some of the other crops. And it also gets going earlier in the spring, so it can it starts to grow again at a lower temperature in the spring, which allows it to use that spring moisture as well. We don't really see any issues with winter kill, things like that, even in the environments around here. So it is really good at getting going and surviving winters. Our varieties are actually relevant kind of across the whole world in the same latitude regions. So varieties that do well here do well in Europe, they do well in Russia. So some of our varieties are grown across all those regions and can handle that cold tolerance in other places as well. In terms of disease, so the hybrid rye is less susceptible to fusarium compared to other cereal crops. So it's a little bit out of sync with the fusarium cycle is kind of the best way to describe it, because it's a little earlier at getting going. Which means that it is less susceptible to fusarium. And I actually had some really interesting conversations in Quebec last week around this, because they have a pretty high fusarium pressure there. And they are really liking it because the straw is actually less contaminated, which means that they're more comfortable using it as bedding and even as feed as well for livestock compared to some of the other crops. So that was something that they saw as a benefit there for their region, right? In terms of ergot, so this picture, I'm going to explain what the picture is. It's basically a bag around a plant, and the picture on the left is a hybrid rye with no pollen plus technology, so this is the trait that we have in our KWS varieties. The one on the right has that trait included with it, and you can kind of see the amount of pollen that's in that bag. So what's happening is that pollen, when you have we use our right seeding practices, our good agronomy practices, to try and get even emergence in the field, even pollination in the field. Plus you have the pollen plus trait, which creates a very large amount of pollen, and it outcompetes the ergot spores being able to get into the head of the plant. So it's not that the plant has a genetic resistance to ergot, but it has a competitive nature to be able to keep ergot out of the head of the plant, if that makes sense. So if you're lucky enough, you might actually get to see pollen plus in action with some of our fields. The weather conditions have to be right to be able to see this, but the picture on the left, so that's actually one from the UK, and that cloud above the field is the pollen. The one on the right, that was in Manitoba last spring, and yeah, so you can actually see the cloud of pollen if the weather conditions are right. I don't know if you guys have been able to see that on occasion with some of the fields. It's pretty neat to be able to see that. And so if you think about it, that amount of pollen. This is not for you. No, if you have allergies, don't go near there.
Actually, I had a customer get me to look at his field because he had all this white stuff on his leaves and he thought it was powdery mildew. Yeah. And I go out there and I'm like, oh, it's pollen.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's what we like seeing that, because when we see that, we know that we're going to have a much lower ergot pressure in that field because you're getting that high pollination, right? So we really do like to see that. Seeing it as a cloud, you got to have the right wind conditions and whatnot, but it is pretty impressive to see. So, okay. I'm going to switch to actual feeding stuff if everyone's good with the crop side. All right. If you have crop questions, Carolyn and Jewel are here. and Greg. So, team's here. So, I am definitely not a crop specialist. I say that I know enough to be dangerous. Okay, so we'll start with the grain side. So we'll talk about pigs, poultry, and cattle with grain feeding, and then we'll switch into forages after that. So this chart here is really just showing the average chemical composition of hybrid rye grain. We don't need to go through all of it, but I want to highlight a couple of things. So one is the crude protein content, and I see you're taking a picture, but I will say in the booklet you have on the swine tech sheet on the back side of it, there's a full table there for you. It'll be easier for you to see it probably, but so the crude protein content is typically around 10%. It depends a little bit on your region, but what we do see is consistent crude protein kind of year to year, variety to variety. We're not seeing big swings in crude protein like you do see in some of the other cereal crops, and this is something that nutritionists really like, because they have a really good understanding of what they're going to get as a protein content. It doesn't matter whether it's Serafino or Trebbiano or any of our varieties, you're going to get a consistent crude protein content. So if you're buying feed into a mill or you're feeding on farm, like, you really have a good feel that you're going to get that consistency, right? So rye does have a fairly high fiber level, so we will talk about that in a few minutes, but the fiber is actually composed of a high level of soluble fiber. So that's the good fiber that even our doctors tell us we should be eating, because it's got a lot of benefits. So we'll talk about that. But those are the beta-glucans, fructans, arabinoxylans, and having those is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. So we'll, on the actual amino acid content, lysine and methionine, we have really good levels. Those tend to be the ones that we need to have a decent consistency with. And then at the very bottom line there, I just want to highlight the intrinsic phytase. So we have about 3,000 phytase units of intrinsic phytase. So typically in a crop, the phytase is bound by phytic acid, and the animal, monogastric animals specifically, can't really access that phosphorus that's in the plant to be able to use it. So for example, wheat has an intrinsic phytase unit of about 500, and we're at 3,000. So this means that the animal can actually use more phosphorus from the plant versus what they'd be able to use from other cereal grains. So it means that there's less phosphorus being excreted back out into the environment, and less reliance on inorganic phosphorus or exogenous phytases going into the diets because of this. So it's actually it's a good thing from an environmental side, but also from a nutritional side. So feeding pigs, I get a lot of people here say that feeding rye to pigs, well, one, they're concerned because of ergot, and two, they don't know how to do it because people don't do it. Well, in Europe, about 60% of the hybrid rye, 60 to 65% of all hybrid rye grown goes to feed pigs. Livestock, but mostly pigs. So it's a huge part of the feed market there. We have a lot of experience with feeding rye to pigs, just not in North America, right? So we're trying to transfer a lot of that data and knowledge here. But we've also put KWS, Canada and US have put a large investment into doing research with swine and in North America, so in both countries, with researchers here on commercial farms as well, but using North American pig genetics and the North American grown crops, and really trying to understand what those values are. So we'll talk about some of those research projects. So this graph here is just showing you the amino acid, digestible amino acid content across a few different cereal crops. So the hybrid rye is in orange. I had to put it in orange because of KWS. And then corn is the green. The two blue bars are hard wheat and soft wheat, and then the purpley pink bar is barley. But you can see in terms of its lysine content, we're actually pretty much on par with the other cereal crops for digestible lysine, better than corn. And then for methionine, which is really the other key one when we're formulating diets, we actually have higher level than barley and even a little bit higher than wheat. So we have a really good amino acid balance for being able to feed livestock. Most people, when they think livestock nutrition, you hear about something that has a high fiber content and you're going to assume that it has a lower energy value for the livestock. So this slide is showing you that that's not actually the case when it comes to hybrid rye. So we've got the different levels of energy, but I'm going to focus on the one on the right. Yes, on the right. So this is the net energy value, and this is basically the energy that is actually available to the pig at the end of the day. So it also accounts for the energy required to digest the product and actually use energy back. So it is the net energy balance. And again, the orange bar is the hybrid rye, green is corn, the blues are the hard and soft wheat, and then the purple one is barley. So we actually have a really good net energy value. We're very similar to corn, very similar to wheat. And it's because even though we have a high fiber level, we have a high soluble fiber level, which means they can actually get an energy source from that. So we'll get into that a little bit too. But in terms of its general nutrition for feeding pigs, we have a great protein content, great amino acid content, and a good energy value. So that from that standpoint, there's no concern about adding it into a pig diet. If you have any pig producers who are really trying to focus on carcass quality, so there are some slaughter plants that are specifically trying to target high quality carcasses to go into export markets like Japan, where they really, really focus on this. And hybrid rye is a really good option for people that are shipping into those markets. So what those markets look for is something called a low iodine value in the carcass. And the iodine value is basically a measure of the unsaturatedness of the fat. So the more kind of floppy the fat is, the less good of a meat quality that you get at the end of a day. And so a portion of the carcass fat can be dictated by what the pig is fed. And hybrid rye actually is the lowest iodine value product of any of the cereal crops that's out there. So if you want to bring your iodine value down in your carcass of your pig, you can do that by increasing the level of hybrid rye that you're feeding to the pigs to try and target that. So for example, in Ontario, I have several farms there that are trying hybrid rye for the first time, and we're going to be actually tracking their carcass iodine values because their slaughter plant is very, very interested in understanding what we can do to try and improve that, because they do ship into Japan and they really, really want to target as many pigs being able to have access to that market as possible. So it does depend a little bit on what you're looking for as an end-use market for your pig as well, but this is an added bonus for a lot of people. Okay, so when it comes to feeding pigs, and so this data is based on not only the research projects that have been done in North America, but also our experience with feeding in Europe. And like any monogastric animal, you want to start them at lower levels when they're younger and smaller because they don't have really great capacity to digest fibers. But as they get older, that capacity gets better. So with nursery pigs, start them at 5 or 10%. You can go all the way up to 30% in nursery pigs. We don't recommend going above that because they are limited on size. They're only so big as an animal and they only have so much capacity. So 30% is the maximum we would say for the later stages of a nursery pig. Grower pigs, again, you keep them at that lower end to start with, but work your way up. They do have a little bit more capacity because they are bigger, so we can go up to 50%. And then in the finisher rations, we can completely replace wheat or corn if we balance the rations properly, and those pigs still do very, very well. For sows, we'll talk about some of the benefits to sows in a minute, but 25 to 50% is totally acceptable to go into the sow rations. We do want to make sure that there is no ergot at all if we're going to be pushing into the sow rations. Ergot can cause sows to stop lactating, so it's definitely recommended that we test all of our feed ingredients before for mycotoxins before we feed, but we do that anyways. So, so always know what you're feeding is kind of my caveat there. What I do find is that sow producers, when they first start, they'll keep the levels to sort of 10 or 15% with their lactating sows. Just for the first little while until they get a feel for how the sows do, and then they'll go up to about 30%. But gestating sows, most people will start around 25-30% and be pretty comfortable with that. So just some practical aspects of feeding for pigs. Like I mentioned earlier, it is less susceptible to ergot and fusarium versus some of the other crops that are out there. But it is always best practice with any feed ingredient, regardless of what it is, to test and make sure you understand exactly what you're feeding, because we do know that different mycotoxins can have impacts on growth performance, health, reproductive performance. So whether it's corn or wheat or barley, we need to be testing anything. So the soluble fiber content, it's really good for a lot of the pigs, but with those young animals, we need to start them at a low level and kind of gradually build them up. You can't just give them high level because they can't handle digesting that, right? It's like a human baby. You're not going to give them something that's got a really high fiber content right off the bat because they just can't handle it. So, and then we always recommend including a carbohydrate digesting enzyme into the diet. So most swine producers will be doing this anyways with their diets that they're going to be feeding. But something like a xylanase will help them get better access to that fiber content that's in there and be able to use it more efficiently. But this is where it gets fun. So maybe before I dive into this, are there any questions on just the basic, like, you know, the chemical composition? We know we have a good value there. We can feed it and not have impacts on performance, that type of thing. Everyone good? Okay. Yep.
Are we also gonna go over different animals? Or?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we'll talk about poultry and cattle as well. So. Okay, so on the pig side, these are what I call functional attributes, and these are things that are maybe a little bit harder to put a dollar value on. But we have research projects that show things like reduced aggression in sows that are housed in groups, reduced piglet losses in the first 24 hours after birth, improved milk yield, reduced pathogens in the intestinal tracts of the pigs, and then reduced tail biting is another thing that we see on some of the farms. So I'm going to go through some of these and walk you through sort of how that's happening. So this first one here, this is a sow project that's it's kind of wrapped up at Laval University in Quebec. So one of the papers has been published now, the other one is in the process of being published. But basically what they did is they fed 4 different treatments to gestating sows, and then they kept them on those same diets for the first 7 days after they farrowed as well. So they had a control diet that was a typical corn, soybean diet, didn't have a high fiber content. They had a fiber diet that did not have rye, so it used like wheat shorts and things like that to bring the fiber content up. And then they had 2 rye diets, one at 30% and one at 60%. There was no impact to the general reproduction performance, sow weight gain, piglets born, piglets weaned, that type of thing. But what they did see was a reduced aggression in the sows during their group housing period. So that's what this graph is showing on the right here, and they actually broke it out into sows that were causing fights, like trying to start fights, and ones that were on the receiving end of that. And what they found is that at that 30% rye inclusion level, the sows actually were less aggressive. At the 60%, their aggression levels went back up. So we think there's a too much point as well. Probably they're not getting quite the nutrient balance that they need at that point. So it was creating some other issues. But that 30% inclusion rate, we saw that aggression level drop. And aggression in group house sows is a big problem on some farms. So this is really kind of cool and something that producers are really interested in. The other thing that they noticed in this project was that at that 30% inclusion level, there was less piglet deaths in the first 24 hours after farrowing. And they attributed that to the sows also being more calm, less aggressive. They're not getting up and down as often. They're not agitated as much. So those piglets have the ability to not have to deal with their mom, who's way heavier than they are, getting up and down and laying on them. There was a second sow project that was done at the University of Illinois in the US. They also saw that same decrease in the number of piglets that were crushed after farrowing as well in their project. So in this case, they had, again, 4 treatments in gestation lactation, the control diet, corn, soybean based, and then they had a 25, 50, and 75% hybrid rye inclusion into that. And again, it was those mid-level inclusion rates that they found the optimal point with. But they saw in this case actually a higher milk yield, so a better average daily gain of the piglets as well in that first, those couple of intermediate groups of rye, but that lower death rate in the piglets. So that's a couple of research projects that we've been able to actually pull that out, which is very interesting. That research group, basically at the end of the day, their comment is that diets with 25 or 50% of the corn replacing, or hybrid rye replacing corn, led to increased performance of these sows. And so they were very comfortable with that. On the nursery pig side, so this project here is actually, it was done in Western Canada by a feed group and done on a commercial farm. So they had over 1,100 piglets, nursery pigs that were used for this project. The piglets were fed a 4-phase feeding program. Phase 1 and 2, when they were really little, didn't have any rye included in, so they included the rye at phase 3 and phase 4. And then they had sort of a moderate level and a high level. So the moderate level, they got 10% and then 20%. The high level, they got 20% and then 40% as they changed diets. What we found from this project, that the 40% was too high. So the pigs actually did drop off in performance when they went up to that 40% inclusion level in the nursery, which is why we have our recommendations maxed out at 30% for those nursery pigs. But if you look at the graphs here, so this top one is the scour index. So this is the indication of diarrhea in these pigs. And the pigs that were on the moderate level group, the red bars, actually had lower diarrhea scores than the other pigs. So that also translated into a reduced mortality rate. So this bottom graph is actually the number of deads or removals from the project. And so they dropped from a 5.2% mortality down to a 4.7% mortality by including hybrid rye at those low levels with nursery pigs. So there is definitely a benefit there to a producer where they maybe don't have to treat the animals as often, they have less diarrhea, and they have more pigs going out the door at the end of the day. That same group did a second project with grow finish pigs, so very similar setup, but this time with slightly older pigs. They had about 1,000 pigs on this project. Again, 3 treatment groups, so there was the control group with no rye, and then they had a moderate rye group that went from 10 up to 25% as the pigs grew, and the high level started at 20% and ramped up to 50% as the pigs grew. In this case, all of the pigs did really well in terms of their performance. There was no impact of going all the way up to 50% by the end of that grow finish phase. But again, they actually saw this decrease in mortality again with including hybrid rye. So they went from a 5.4% mortality in the grow finish phase down to a 4.3% with that high level of rye inclusion in these diets. So these are benefits that the producer is getting that are not necessarily tied to growth performance, but it's more pigs out the door, more pork out the door at the end of the day, and less treatments required because the pigs are healthier. So I threw this up here just as a couple of testimonials from some pig producers in Canada that are feeding hybrid rye and are quite happy with it. So the one on the top left, Egbert Dietman, When I first chatted with Egbert, he said that they've been feeding rye for about a year at that point with their pigs, and when they started feeding it, all the tail biting in their barn stopped. I saw Egbert a couple of months ago, and we were chatting, and they ran out of rye in December and had to switch to wheat, and he said all their tail biting came back as soon as they had to switch that diet. So they did everything in their power at that point to try and find some more rye that they could purchase and bring in. And so once they were back on rye, they saw that tail biting drop off again. So they are definitely a believer in hybrid rye and some of these other added benefits. And that's related to that soluble fiber content and the pigs being more calm and feeling more full for longer. If you think about it, if you eat a piece of like dark European rye bread versus a piece of processed white bread, which one makes you feel more full for longer, right? And the pigs are seeing that same effect. It's a more stable release of glucose throughout the day. You're not getting a big sugar spike and then a drop. And so the animals are just more content and not beating each other up to the same extent. The other producer, Brett, he's actually been feeding hybrid rye. He would have been one of the very early adopters back in probably 2016, 2017 as the crop first started to get out commercially in the country. And he has grown it every year since. We actually have a picture later on in Zach's presentation of some pigs from his farm, and he does things a little bit differently. So depending on the year and what he needs in his rotation, he will either take it for grain or forage and use it as forage for the pigs as well. So, any pig questions before I switch to?
Just one. I'm just curious about the aggression. The first one. That was one of the hypotheses of the experiment, or they were just looking at that during the experiment.
Yeah. So for that project, they had cameras set up to monitor all the behavior of the animals. So they did believe that because of the soluble fiber and the lower glycemic index, so the slower release of insulin to those sows. Sows are always limit fed, they're always hungry, right? So if you can provide them a diet that maybe makes them feel more full for longer, they were hoping they would see some benefits on the aggression side. And so they had cameras set up, they were monitoring that behavior. They actually had like pedometers and things like that on the animals as well, so they could monitor whether they were not just moving around, but they also were able to measure whether they were sitting and laying and like all their position changes, and they were able to look at all of that. The groups of pigs were mixed, so the feeding system that they had in place allowed them to have all of the treatment groups in the same pen, but still control which diet the pigs were getting. And so that was what allowed them to actually measure whether there was a difference between the treatment groups within a pen, right? So which ones were being more aggressive, and the 30% rye pigs were the lowest on the, yeah. Good? Okay, so we do have some information on poultry. I am going to start by saying that we are in the process of developing more research on the poultry side. So we have a good understanding that we can feed relatively, I'd say on the lower end of levels with poultry very successfully, but for us to be able to push levels higher in poultry, we need some more data that we don't have yet. And so we are working on those research projects to be able to get that data. So hopefully next year we'll have some more answers where we can maybe start to drive our inclusion rates up higher with poultry, but for now I'm keeping my recommendations a little bit more on the conservative side until we get some of those answers. Poultry are a little bit different than pigs, so their intestinal tract is smaller and they do have less capacity to digest fiber than pigs do, which, you know, I just told you the fiber is a really good benefit for pigs. So with poultry, we kind of have to find a bit of a balance between that fiber content and their ability to digest it. What we do know is that our hybrid rye varieties do have lower levels of certain anti-nutritional factors, which have been a problem with conventional rye in poultry in the past. So as we start to look to the hybrid rye varieties, We don't see things like feed intake drops that we used to see when we would feed conventional rye and things like that. So we're trying to understand that a little better and look at those mechanisms, but we do see that the birds like the hybrid rye and we can include it. So there's a growing interest in its use as well because of that. Again, that consistent crude protein quality, the consistent energy protein balance with the rye makes it relatively easy for a nutritionist to formulate with and work with for poultry as well. We definitely recommend including some of those carbohydrate enzymes, so xylanase or an NSPase of some sort, because the birds really do need that help to try and get access to that fiber and use it and not have a problem with the fiber. So this is what we have for our recommended levels at this point in time for poultry. Layers, we seem to be able to handle 10 to 20% without too much of an issue, so we'll go through some data there. Broilers seem to be able to handle a little bit more than the layers can, so we can go up to about 30%. And then with turkeys, I have it at 5 to 10% with a star above, and that star is to indicate that I have not seen any data where anyone has tried to go above 10%. So I think we can. I just don't have any data. So turkeys should be able to handle the fiber better than broilers and layers can, but so that's the caveat. Our recommendation right now is sort of 10% or lower, but I think we could go higher. We just need to try. When it comes to some of the other attributes related to poultry, so we definitely have seen some projects with reduced improved growth performance of the animals. We've seen reduced body fat of the animals, which is a benefit if you're trying to create chicken meat. We see, similar to pigs, we've seen a change in the bacterial population in the intestinal tract towards more of the good bacteria. Improved structure of the intestine, and then with eggs we've seen an improvement to the egg quality as well. So we'll quickly flip through some of those. So this first one, this is a broiler project, and you'll notice that all of the research projects on the chicken side so far have been done in Europe, and we are working on building some research here in North America to really focus on our bird population and genetics here and the varieties that we have here. So in this case, it was, they basically broke the treatments into a starter, grower, finisher ration with the broilers, and they had 4 treatments. So the one treatment, the birds started at 5%, went up to 10%. The next treatment, they started at 10%, went up to 20%. And then 15 up to 30. So there was sort of a control group and then a low, medium, and higher level. In this case, what they actually found was that higher inclusion rate, the birds did better. So they had a better body weight gain, better feed conversion, and they found the decreased abdominal fat in the birds in that project. So up to 30%, they were pretty comfortable saying that, they got some good results out of that. On another broiler project, so this one had 3 treatment groups, so a control group and then a medium group that was 25% inclusion and a high group that was 50% inclusion. And this one they were actually looking at the intestinal tract and the bacterial populations. And so the main one to look at is actually this last one here, and this is the E. coli population, which is, everyone's heard of E. coli, not really a good bacteria to have. We prefer a lower level of that. And with that high inclusion level of hybrid rye, they actually saw a decrease in the E. coli concentrations in the intestinal tract of those birds. And so that fiber that's in the rye can actually prevent binding of E. coli and sort of flushes it out of the system, but it also changes the intestinal population towards bugs that are wanting to digest that fiber content and away from those pathogenic bacteria. So similar to what we see in pigs, we see in poultry there. This is kind of a bit of a technical paper as well, but they did 4 dietary treatments with broilers. So they had a 0% inclusion, so a control, and a 20% inclusion, and then they either included or did not include a xylanase enzyme because they wanted to be able to see what the impact of that was. And in this one, they were actually looking at the structure of the intestine and trying to figure out what's happening to the ability of the birds to absorb nutrients. And so they found increased intestinal crypt depth, villi height, the ratio, and an increase to the absorptive surface area. So that's a lot of technical terms to say that it actually increased the amount of absorptive capacity for nutrients that those birds have by adding rye into the diet. So it's shifting away from the bad bacteria, but it's also actually changing the intestinal structure to have more ability to absorb nutrients with those inclusion levels. What that means in the long run is hard for us to understand right now because we need to do some further research to understand what the actual digestibility values and things like that are. So that's sort of the next phase that we're initiating in our research program. For layer birds, this was a project where they went up to 25% inclusion with the layers. There was no change really to egg size or eggshell quality, things like that. But what they did see was an increase in the albumin weight, an improvement to the fatty acid profile in eggs, so a shift more towards the good fats that humans like versus the bad fats, the easy way to say it. And then, so an increase in omega-3 fatty acids, a decrease in saturated fat, things like that. So they actually saw a shift towards a better egg in terms of what us as consumers of eggs would like to see in them. So that was up to 25% inclusion. And this next layer project, they only went up to 20% inclusion in this one, but again, they saw no major changes to things like the laying rate of the birds or the eggshell quality or size. But in this case, the rye was whole rye, so they basically cracked it and then just kind of included it into the ration. They didn't grind it up the same way that the other projects did. And they had no problem going up to 20%, no negative impacts or anything like that. They didn't see as many benefits as if it had been ground up like it was in the other projects, but they were still very comfortable going up to 20% inclusion with the layers. And this is the one turkey paper that I mentioned, so we really only have one trial with this. It did have over 17,000 turkeys on it, so there's a lot of data and power to this project, but they only went up to 10% inclusion, and what they found at the end of the day is birds did very well on 10% inclusion. We probably could have pushed that higher and really tried to understand how far we could go, but as a first project, we're good with that. So no impact to the performance of the animals, the litter quality, foot pad health. One concern with poultry is because of the fiber content in rye, with that soluble fiber, it could potentially increase the moisture levels in the excreta of the birds, which could lead to issues with feet health because they're on the litter, and air quality in the barn. And what we find is at these low levels, we're not seeing those impacts. And as long as someone's got kind of maintaining their ventilation system in their barn, then we're not seeing any concerns from that side of things. So in terms of management, again, like pigs, include an enzyme, maintain that good ventilation to try and help reduce any damp litter that you might end up with, but we haven't really seen that show up in any of the projects with those low levels of inclusion. If you have a grower who wants to push higher levels of inclusion, you definitely want to make sure that they're someone who is managing their barn well, right, and paying attention to things like that. And then one of the challenges with some of the poultry work is trying to figure out what energy value to assign to hybrid rye at this point, because we haven't done the research projects to really understand what those energy values should be. And so I have a value here on the slide of 12.86 megajoules per kilogram. That seems to be a value that when the research projects have good success, that's the area that they're aiming for with their energy. But we are doing more research to try and narrow down what that looks like. And so next year, hopefully we'll have some better answers on that one. I think that's my last slide. Okay, I've gone through all the monogastric stuff, so before we switch to cattle, it's tough.
So basically you're saying shouldn't completely replace wheat and check it out.
At this point, no, I would say keep the levels to a partial replacement, which does make it a bit of a logistic challenge if you have to kick something out of a feed mill to put a new grain in, right? I do understand that. I'm hoping next year we can really better understand how far we can push the levels. But right now, with all of the research work that's been done, basically people have just tried to say, okay, I'm gonna replace a portion of wheat or corn or whatever it might be with rye, but they haven't done the work to really understand what amino acid digestibility is, what energy digestibility is. That research hasn't been done. So we're doing that because then we can better fine tune the ration formulations and we should be able to push those levels higher. But until we have that basic understanding of what the birds actually can use in terms of its nutrient profile, I need to keep those recommendations a little more conservative.
And I guess most of the research is with pelletized feed.
It's a mix, to be honest, on the poultry side, and some of the research projects didn't report whether they were pelleted or mixed or mash, but I do think there's a bit of a mix going on there. What we do know, and I don't have it in the slide deck, rye actually makes a better pellet than wheat does. And so that's something that we've seen in a project that was done in Quebec with 10 commercial feed mills, and they asked them to pellet using rye instead of wheat as the binder. And in every one of those feed mills, the rye pellet had the better pellet quality versus the wheat one. So I do have like a one-pager I can show you on that. But yeah,
We make mash.
everything is mash. Yeah. So. Yeah, and I have, there's lots of, especially on the swine side, there's lots of people that are milling their own feed on farm, and all of that is going out as mash, not as pellet, right? And yeah, they don't have any issues with it from that perspective. So. Yeah, but the poultry projects, there's not a lot of data, right? There's only a few projects. I've got a ton of swine projects I can pull information from. I have a small set for poultry. And they seem to be mixed, and not all of them reported whether it was mash or pellet. So. Okay. Other questions? We're good. Zach can talk cattle.
Do you want me to sort of?
Yeah, if you're okay going over there,
Yeah.
then my camera's in the right spot. So if you're good with that,
We'll switch. There's a pointer here if you want it.
Awesome.
I'm probably just gonna stop.